So moving forward here to another story, one that I actually really wish was getting more coverage than it is outside of the state of Virginia, and that is the recently reported attempted self-immolation by a number of prisoners at Red Onion State Prison, the Supermax prison there in the state of Virginia, Rania and I's home state. And we are very, very honored to be joined here once again on the show to discuss this and more by two Black. So, poet, organizer, host of the Black Mist podcast, and author of the book, relatively new book, Laundering Black Rage, The Washing of Black Death, People, Property, and Profits. As always, two Black, great to have you with us.
Thank you, thank you. I'm not much of a dog or cat person, so I don't know if I fit in here or not, but yeah, happy to be back.
We appreciate the honesty.
Mhm.
We're honest on
But
this
you know,
show.
pro animal though, just not in my home, but pro animal. Yeah.
Respect.
Yeah.
This story that has been floating around for several weeks now, I believe it was political prisoner Kevin Rashid Johnson who broke the story. I know the Virginia Defender out of Richmond has done some more reporting here, but there's been some dispute. I know the state is saying that the story is either only partially true or not true. So if you could just tell us what we know about these at least attempted self-immolations there in Red Onion.
Yeah, there's different reports, but from what I've been able to read, 6 people self-immolated, as in caught themselves on fire as a means of protest, not just as a means of self-harm, as the state's trying to depict it. And this has been over a series of months. This hasn't all just happened, I believe, if I'm correct, like just in one day, but over a series of time. Several people, 6 people within the prison have attempted to do that. And one of them was saying because there's they don't have a center for these things inside the prison, so they know when they get burned, they have to be sent to another prison. And they're doing this in protest to get out of the prison because the conditions are so horrible. And this is not uncommon. Here in Indiana, my co-director of the Pendleton 2 film that we put on this station, King Trill, aka Jock, he once went on a hunger strike purposely to get transferred. Like that was the goal, to get transferred out, because some of these prisons are just so unbearable. You're trying to get to the prison that is, I guess, semi inhabitable. None of them are great, but some of them are safer and some of them have more funding and resources. So you're just trying to get to that, similar to someone trying to get to a better plantation.
So, what's interesting about this prison in particular is back in my early days of journalism, I actually focused quite a bit on criminal justice issues, or should I say criminal injustice system issues. And I actually wrote a piece in 2012. I pulled it up because I was like, I know Red Onion. Yes. I was like, I know Red Onion State Prison because, okay, so there was a hunger strike back then. Mm-hmm. And I remember looking into this prison and just being completely horrified. I mean, a lot of prisons across the country that are super max or like maximum security have a lot of really horrific conditions. But this one in particular, I mean, they were like breaking fingers and like just blatantly torturing people. So I guess, I mean, that was 2012. There was a hunger strike. That's why I was writing about that. I was covering a hunger strike at Red Onion State Prison over those conditions. Now we're talking about over a decade later. Can you tell us a bit about the conditions in this prison? It must be pretty bad for people to light themselves on fire. That is a desperate plea for help.
Yeah, well, I mean, there was this was in the People's Dispatch. There was a report by Amnesty International about this prison and Human Rights Watch, primarily about the Supermax. And a lot of people may not know about Supermaxes, but people are spending in Supermax, you're spending 23 hours on lockdown, solitary. You're in segregation. That means you don't get out of your cell. Many times these cells are windowless. You don't have much human contact. When you walk out of your cell, you have to lock up, and then they escort you on a dog leash somewhere else, and you get maybe an hour of rec time to move around, and that's mainly just so you don't die. So when you listen to some of the stories of the prisoners who set themselves on fire, they're talking about guards who were physically abusing them. who could not get any medical attention. The brother who just talked about leaving, trying to get out because he knew that there wasn't a center for the burning. Talked about how the guard said, that was nice what you did, but we'll see you when you get back," in a way like, as a threat, right? Like this is what was said. So it doesn't seem like it was necessarily coordinated as in some kind of organizational thing, but it just seems like it caught on as a means of protest to get out. I mean, again, we know this is in Virginia. Wait, there's a just thinking about just so many different prisons, man. I could go all day, but thinking about there's another prison in Virginia, Buckingham correctional facility. Shaka Shakur, who actually comes out of Indiana, got into an altercation with the guard, and they here in Indiana, and they sent him to Virginia, even though he's an Indiana prisoner who had been tortured and spent time on lockup and here in Indiana. If you think about Westville, Indiana, there was a supermax there, the MCC, and we were talking about people burning themselves. Well, I know in the '90s there was a brother who cut off his finger and tried to mail it to the governor to bring attention. Right. So this is just how these prisons operate. So in Red Onion, it's no different. It's funny because here in Indiana there was a similar Human Rights Watch report done on the MCC in Westville, and then that was done as well with the Red Onion prison too.
Yeah, unbelievable in so many. Buckingham is actually not that far from where I grew up, and just the stories you hear from people are just harrowing on many levels. And it brings me to a segue here that I think is related, and I want to talk about your book, which I think is a very important book, and I think it speaks to a critical issue because obviously when you look at the prison system disproportionately Black, we can look at so many of the things that we could go on here. The theme of the anger of Black America has become sort of a broader cultural undercurrent in American life, I think, especially since Ferguson. And your new text, or new-ish text, I should say, just to let people know again, Laundering Black Rage, the washing of Black death, people, property, and profits, is looking at this sort of intersection of, I think, the greater prominence, you might say, of Black rage and sort of the cultural sphere of capitalist America, but looking at some of the contradictions of that. So, I mean, just give maybe people a synopsis of what you're addressing in the text and how you're looking at some of this.
Yeah, I'd probably have to come back to talk about that. I could go all day as well, but I guess to put it shortly, I'm a co-author of that book. My co-author, me and Rasul Mawad, we were trying to understand in 2020. It's not really about 2020, but we noticed in 2020, following the George Floyd uprisings, there was almost immediately these calls to do things that did not resolve the problem. That fundamentally, so the Black rage was being funneled into Black capitalism. The Black rage and the rage that others shared was being funneled into diversity statements and DEI, and it was also being used to fund repression. Right, it was being used to give police more budgets. It was being used to give police more cameras, more equipment, etc. So the idea was this is a form of laundering, right? And not in not a metaphorical sense, but an actual form of laundering where the Black rage becomes this capital that is then inserted into the state through capitalism's different means of production, and it comes out on the other end as some kind of commodity to quell that rage and to keep it within the containment of the state. I don't think that's limited to Black rage as well. I know y'all were talking about Syria. I think you can see a very similar situation where legitimate rage at the state of what people were dealing with in Syria got totally turned into now where you have it being ran by terrorists that America wants to say or not, right? And it's destabilizing the region, and also destabilizing resistance across the region, right? So, but that came from a legitimate place, but there's a way that because the rage has to go through the actual means of production, it has to labor through it. It's not just a feeling, and we talk about it as a sense of labor, that it could be turned against you and used as ways to, again, either repress, or we say bribe, and we say many of these institutions operate as fronts. On one side, they sell you that they're doing something good, and they might even be doing that. Like they might be providing food or like any front we think about, but in the back they're selling drugs, right? So that's what the state typically does. So a prison will say it's there to rehabilitate you, and I don't think it does much of that. But at the same time, it's a form of national oppression. It's a form of counterinsurgency, and so on and so forth. The United States might invade a country and say the military is here to liberate the people, or they might fund a group to quote unquote liberate the people, and that's just a front for other action. But they use the rage, the pain, the suffering of people as a means to launder, to create this other outcome that goes against the will of the people, and sometimes done with the consent of people to the point where they don't even realize it themselves. That's usually the scariest part.
It really is, and I think one thing that's important that is uh, advertised as being talked about in this book, which I'm very excited to read, is the idea of upending that process you just described through the anti-colonial struggle, and you call it a reverse laundering conquest, which sounds really cool. So, can you talk? I guess summarize briefly, because we could talk about this for hours. What you mean by upending that laundering process?
Well, yeah, at some point it almost upends itself because it causes total destruction, right? I mean, we're watching this now with climate or other things that are going on. Reverse laundering, the definition is to take something that is legitimate to fund something that is illegitimate. And I don't want to speak too specifically because I don't want to get anybody in trouble. But you follow in terms of you take something. So, for example, if I'm well, not me, because again, I'm not doing any of these things. But if someone is engaged, if they just have a regular job, they make their money from their paycheck, and then they use that money to fund something that exists outside of the system. People can fill in their imagination for what that is. That could be done nefariously, like we see in the United States, where they took legitimate congressional funds to fund, the Contras, and to sell guns abroad and use that money to fund dirty wars, right? Like that was reverse laundering. But there's a way that since we live in a capitalist system and the resources have to come through our hands to do the laundering, that there's a way that those resources can be reversed to fund something that's not legitimized by the state, that's not legitimized by capital, that doesn't even necessarily need to be in the forefront or needs to be loud or screaming, but it's something we can fund, or not even fund as in just money, but whatever resources we have. I've talked to people in talks. I say, whatever your surplus is, if you have patience, you have a surplus of patience, you have a surplus of space, you have a surplus of money, you have a surplus of time, whatever that is, using that surplus that some of us have to fund things that are not legitimized by the state, to resource things that are not legitimized by the state, to upend that process for our own liberation. I hope that answers that.
Well, it's a good start, but you never want to answer it fully because you want people to buy the book and go out and get it. So I think it gives people just enough of a taste to get out there. Laundering Black Rage, The Washing of Black Death, People, Property, and Profits, of which you were the co-author. And, just as always on all of these points, Too Black, always great to have you with us. Really appreciate you taking time and joining us here on the Freedom Side.
All right. Thank you. Thanks for having me on.